Hey again! Today on Playing Goddess, we're covering geological events on a large scale. So, what does this mean? Well, it means we're covering some fun stuff, like tectonic plates, continental drift, erosion, supervolcanoes, earthquakes, landslides of a large scale, and subsequent tsunamis, which may be caused by such. Fun stuff. Wait, I already said that. I don't know. It's fun to me. Anyway, let's get started. So, first of all these ideas have one major thing in common. They're based upon the planet's crust and or mantle shifting and changing in some way, shape, or form. So, what are these things to begin with? Well, a living planet, as in one which is still undergoing geological processes and still has an electromagnetic field, has a few major parts to it. The first of these we'll cover is at the very center, the planet's core. For most solid rock planets, we're looking at predominantly an iron core. It's exceptionally hot, and the pressure within the core is immense, and these things combined keep the iron in a liquid state, sloshing about. This is important. You need a liquid core to generate your electromagnetic field for your planet. No EMF, no protection from the hazards of space like radiation or solar flares. I know we've covered this before, but it's important to do another quick cover of it. A big planet takes a long time to cool off. Smaller planet takes disproportionately less time. It's basically an exponential curve. Bigger is better in this case. If you have a tiny little planet like Mars, Mars cooled off before life even really formed on Terra, probably. Mars went through, the various stages of planetary development, of being a molten mass, to cooling off, to being able to support life, to being a dead world relatively rapidly. This does mean that there's actually a pretty reasonable chance that life did originate on Mars before it did on Terra. But it would have been single-celled organisms and probably wouldn't have progressed beyond that point because it cooled off too fast. The planet's core died, becoming solid, and whatever atmosphere it had got thinned out severely. And whatever life it had got destroyed under high-energy particle bombardment from space. Maybe in the meantime, a meteor skimmed the surface of Mars, picked up a few microbes, and kept going until it crashed into Terra. So there's the chance that we're technically all descended from Martians. But the more important part is that Mars is dead. It's too small to support life long enough for the evolution process to take it to a period where there's advanced enough civilizations to bother talking about. But that's for solitary planets. What about a moon? Moons. Though even smaller still, usually. These moons are locked in orbit with their planet. Some moons get crushed and squeezed because of that orbit, and as such maintain a liquid core for a much, much longer period of time, and can mooch off the field of the bigger planet. Things such as Io, one of Jupiter's moons, which gets all this lovely tidal heating, is enough to produce enormous volcanoes, despite it's too small to have a liquid core just in and of itself without Jupiter's gravity assist in this case. So, with that in mind, let's move on to the next part of our planet, shall we? Well, since we don't really need to bother with the specific details between the inner core and the outer core for this level of world design, the next part is going to be the mantle. Now the thing is, you have to have a pretty big planet to have mantle. The reason for this is that the core is going to be, well, hot. It's liquid, and it's the densest body of the materials. As such, the core generally defines itself pretty much on its own, but the upper layers, oh, they're more solid, and it takes some time to sort out the different layers of rock and such. This planetary differentiation means heavier elements tend to mostly sink downward towards the core, while lighter elements rise upward toward the surface. Over a long enough period of time, the physical movement and chemical reactions that take place will tend to form distinctive layers, if the world's big enough for its core to not go cold in the meantime. Since your planet will want to support life, that means you're probably going to have a mantle, which is a series of layers of hot rock divided up by density. Most of the time, it's going to be predominantly silicates. Sometimes it can actually be made of ice if the world is small enough and uses means other than molten rock to move the interior around, such as compression due to a tight orbit of a heavier body. So it's just what you get on Titan, another of Jupiter's moons. Anyway, the point is that if your planet is big enough to support life, it's almost guaranteed got a mantle. The thing about the mantle of a planet is that it's technically a solid rock or ice or whatever. But when you look at it in geological scales of time, like millions of years, it acts more like a really viscous fluid. Kind of like glass. Like, if you have any glass windows that have been around for like 50-ish years or so, yeah, the bottom of the glass is thicker than the top. Yet it's still technically a solid, despite that it actually does flow downward over the years. The mantle is kind of like that. Now the mantle's moving about, it shifts and so on. Sure, it's rock, but it still moves a little bit. Sometimes you get pockets where that movement produces so much friction and pressure that it goes from just acting sorta like a liquid over millions of years to instead actually being a liquid. These are fun things like magma deposits. Fun. Wait, why is magma fun? Well, for that, we need to move on to the next layer, the crust. The crust isn't all that hot, at least not compared to the interior of a planet, and it's pretty thin, usually only a few kilometers thick. Think of it like large rocky islands floating on a large rocky ocean. The mantle's sorta liquidy-ish, and the crust just floats on top. And because of this, though, we get all sorts of neat interactions. You know that magma we were talking about a moment ago? Well, sometimes that magma builds up in pressure. It's awfully hot there in the mantle, after all, and that crust is pretty thin. Like 5,000 kilometers of mantle versus 5 kilometers of crust. Kind of an eggshell, really, at least in comparison. What happens when there's a crack in the crust above one of these magma deposits? Oh, that magma's all squeezed and under pressure. And the moment it's given somewhere to go, you get a volcano. Yay, volcanoes! That's where you get new islands from, new land masses. A large portion of the surface of Terra was originally made from magma that rose up to the surface. There's other methods, but we'll get to that in a bit. For now, just consider that the land your home stands upon possibly was once in the mantle, and then it flowed up to the surface and mixed with the rock of the crust, and to make a more interesting mix. If you live somewhere like Hawaii, it almost guaranteed was. Now, that's what happens when you have a large magma deposit and a crack up towards the surface so it can escape. On larger scales, you get super volcanoes, which are so massive that they can cover many kilometers across their caldera alone. We have a number of them on Terra, actually, and if any one of them erupts, it's a worldwide restructuring of pretty much everything when they do. Like, you know that picture you normally get of a volcano where it's like this tall cone, sort of like a mountain with some fire at the top? Yeah, supervolcanoes don't look like that. They're so massive that the entire cone falls into the hole, and you just get this massive crater filled with lava kind of dealy. Yay! A normal volcano might spit out, a cubic kilometer of rock, while a supervolcano dumps out 1,000 or more cubic kilometers worth. Tiny difference on scale, that. A supervolcano releases so much dust and soot into the atmosphere that you get global warming on a scale that's hard to ignore. And then you get global cooling because it acts as a shield against the sun's light for a few months to decades at a time. It's pretty nasty stuff and can account for mass extinction level events where animals that can't survive the sudden change in climate and temperature just don't make it. Yeah, you can have a setting where a supervolcano just erupted and the subsequent events are cataloged. It'd be like a zombie apocalypse, sans the zombies, and with a lot more soot. Now, to go back to the whole geological stuff, don't you need, something to make a crack for a volcano in the first place? I mean, let's face it, 5 to 10 kilometers of rock isn't a small amount to make a hole through. Sure, it's small compared to the mantle, but that crust is still pretty thick. Like, Mount Everest is only 8 kilometers tall, and that's about the thickness of solid rock between you and the mantle, so what can even break a hole in the rock that thick? A few things really, but one of the biggest would be related to plate tectonics. So let's go into that for a moment, shall we? So, plate tectonics is the idea that the crust isn't really one big flat solid surface, but rather a bunch of islands floating on top of the mantle which just happen to be squeezed so tightly together that they don't really move all that much. Note that key phrase, all that much, not they don't ever move. It's kind of important here. These rock islands floating on a sea of even more rock are squeezed pretty tightly together, but there's still technically a gap there at the edge where they meet. What happens when you shove two of these enormous continent-sized islands together? Well, sometimes one just lifts a little bit and the other slides under it. This is where you get stuff like subduction zones, where the crust from one of these monstrously huge islands gets shoved under the crust of another and dips down into becoming a part of the mantle. On the opposite end, some of that mantle rises up into the open to be that new replacement end of the island, and over time, these islands completely replace the top layer with new rock from below. At, a few centimeters a year. Yeah, I know we're looking at, thousands of kilometers of island being replaced a few centimeters at a time. It takes a while. Usually. Sometimes it doesn't take that long for small sections to skip ahead. See, when you have two of these giant rock islands squeezing up against each other, sometimes they get stuck. They're still pressing tighter and tighter together, but they ain't moving. That's kinda bad. That pressure keeps building because they're still moving. And sure, it's only a few centimeters, but if this goes on for a few hundred years, that's like a few meters worth of landmass that should have slid past one another, but it didn't. It's just building up pressure, lots of it. Have you ever tried to shove a car that was stuck? Where it rocks back and forth and finally slips out of the mud or snow or whatever, and it just moves all at once? Yeah, now picture that. Instead of something as heavy as a car, it's a car the size of Europe. Oh. Yeah, that's not going to be pretty when it suddenly does finally move. This is one of the most common forms of where you get earthquakes from. It's what happens when those tightly squeezed together rock islands suddenly decide they've had enough and they're going to do their movement thing whether you like it or not. Fortunately, this isn't a problem most of the time. Usually it's just a nice, moderately even movement that goes on. Sometimes the borders of these rock islands, otherwise known as tectonic plates, are a bit less smooth and with more gaps, or they just don't fit together all that nicely. This is where you get things like the Ring of Fire. Like, seriously, that's an actual name for the ring around the Pacific plate, since it's ringed by tons of volcanoes where it doesn't really line up all that well with the plates next to it. Usually, though, as stated, these plates just slide across each other or drift slowly around, and there's no real issue. This is your whole plate tectonics thing. The continents will, over long periods of time, shift and change shape. And most of the time, it's irrelevant to our interests in world design, because we're mostly focused upon how sapient life interacts with the world. The timescales we're looking at in plate tectonics are so large that not just entire empires will rise and fall, but entire species will rise and go extinct and branch off into entirely different species in the time it takes for there to be any noticeable difference, as in areas that were separated by ocean end up having land masses touch and so on, where different species can cross or fail to cross the gap between the plates. So, for the most part, you don't need to worry about plate tectonics in general, unless you're specifically trying to state that this species moved to this biome at this time, which may be important, but probably not that often. We'll get into that kind of stuff more during the evolutionary process down the line anyway, so let's skip over that for now, as there's a lot of other information needed to really make use of that, which we haven't covered yet. Now, there are things that happen slowly, but fast enough that matter to us. Erosion's a big one. It can take thousands of years to make a major impact, sometimes millions, but it can also be fast enough for it to actually matter in a single individual's lifetime. As water flows over rock, little tiny particulates in the water will graze across the rock's surface, scratching at it, chipping off tiny flakes here and there at a time. It's a small effect at first, but it does gradually dig out channels, and as it starts to dig out a hole, it now has a greater surface area and can dig a bigger hole faster. It does, however, take a very long time for water to dig through solid rock. Erosion against softer stuff, though, like simple soil or sand or sandstone, much bigger of a change and much faster. For example, my grandfather used to have a cottage by the shore of the Atlantic Ocean. key phrase there is used to have, you may note. Without a proper foundation, though, each year clumps of the soil would fall under high tide. A big storm with a large storm surge would simply take a lot of the ground out with it to the ocean, and these could happen a few times a year. Every time, that shoreline crept a bit closer, sometimes a few centimeters, sometimes a few meters at a time would fall away. There isn't a cottage there anymore, because the front yard of that cottage went from being huge, a good 100 meters long, tons of room, to less than nothing, where even the foundation simply went away in the span of barely 60 years. Erosion of this manner can play a very big deal in things like borders, and especially when it comes to the defining aspects of a city, as most cities are built on rivers, lakes, seas, or oceans. Without a solid rock foundation, what seemed like a good spot to build a castle may soon find itself crumbling into the waves. Now, this is basically what a landslide is. A large amount of rain or storm washes away the topsoil from a steep slope of soil, and once it starts to move, it begins digging out holes and trenches, and those holes fill with water and make bigger holes, and soon the entire slope becomes unstable, and you can see an entire chunk of land slide down a mountainside pretty quickly all in one go. And these aren't necessarily small events either. With a big enough hill or a mountain and loose enough soil in a heavy enough downpour, you can have half a town vanish in just a few minutes. Oh, it may have been building up to that point for decades, but when it actually starts to collapse, it does so pretty quickly. So, what happens to all of that land? Well, we did mention a mountainside, but seaside cliffs are also an issue. Picture, if you will, for a moment, the idea of a huge, towering cliff, hundreds of meters tall, and it's gradually worn down around the base so that it has an outcropping above the water of the ocean. Now, let's give it a little kickstart. Let's say we have an earthquake. The ground shakes and trembles. There's a crack formed. Not enough to split that overhang, but enough to give it a crack in the foundation. Next big storm, water gets into it, pouring down into the crack, eating away at the soil, making it bigger. Then it freezes. The water expands into ice, prying open the gap even further. And then the thaw in spring, that ice melts, and heavy rivers of water pour down, eating away even more of the soil, and yeah, it falls. Thousands of cubic meters of soil fall hundreds of meters into the ocean. Ever dropped a stone in a lake or a glass of water? It splashes, doesn't it? Now imagine that on a scale billions of times larger. It forms a tsunami, a huge displacement of water which flows out, and because fluids don't compress very well, that means the water displacement keeps going out and out. A major landslide, like we just described, can carry across from one side of a lake to the other and flood a forest up to the treetops with ease. In the event of a major underwater earthquake, a sudden shift of a fault line can create mega tsunamis. Yeah, I didn't name them, but the point is that you can get even more water being displaced at once. Note that I state water being displaced. You don't tend to get what you stereotypically view as a wave seen on TV, where the water is a wall moving forwards. It's generally more like just a really fast tide. The actual waves don't move so much as the height of the water in one location just increases and then decreases. It's tough to show without pictures, and my budget isn't high enough at that, so I'll advise that you go look up some other videos if you're really interested in seeing how that works. Anyway, the point is that with a mega tsunami, these things can cross oceans. A major earthquake along the European side of the Atlantic Ocean can traverse the entire ocean and then make landfall on the North American side of the same ocean. The thing is, almost once a small pinpoint location on one side increases in an arc, the further it travels, the bigger the total space covered. When you have enough force to travel an entire ocean, well, it's gonna take a few hours to travel the distance, but when it makes landfall, it's gonna make a mess. This is a good way for an entire city to be wiped off the face of the map overnight. Go to bed one day, capital city of a nation. Wake up the next day, and it's just not there anymore. As such, geological events are massively important in terms of shaping history. Volcanic islands tend to be exceptionally well suited to farming due to a lot of nutrients being added to the soil on a regular basis. Capital cities tend to form near water because it's useful for trade, travel, survival, and so on. These are locations that are exceptionally dangerous, you may notice. Where civilizations build are near resources, but those resources tend to be there specifically because of the potential for major natural disasters. I mean, they had to get there somehow. All it takes to change the course of a war is for one of the capital cities to vanish overnight into the caldera of a volcano, or to be consumed by a pyroclastic flow, the ground split up and swallowed whole, or to be drowned in a mega tsunami. Because of this, when you're creating your world, you'll want to consider some pretty big events happening. We have tales all throughout our own history of such, from the death of Pompeii to the sinking of Atlantis. Now, the tales tend to be embellished, but that just makes for a better story to be told later on. We can clearly see what happens, though. In Pompeii's example, mass sacrifices to the gods were made by those who decided to stay, hoping it would help assuage the anger of those same gods. Others conducted a mass exodus, evacuating the city entirely, since they had the time to do so. With such mass confusion, it wasn't surprising that there were huge amounts of looting and breakings going around, stealing from the caravans loaded with worldly possessions and, well, little to no guards. You can argue that humans suck and are cruel to each other, but it's not a limitation associated with humanity in this case. It's the nature of life. Those who exploit resources survive. Those who don't die off. Within any species, fantasy, alien, or generic human, there will be those members who exploit resources mercilessly, and those who won't for any of a number of reasons. Keep that in mind when you do your homework this week. So, since we're on that topic, homework! Yay! This week, your homework is to come up with 3 major geological events which drastically change the face of your world, regardless of the scale of the world you're working on. Whether it's a small town or an entire planet is irrelevant at this stage of the game. All that matters is that throughout its history, several major events took place from geological causes. Write them out. Think about the impact they would have initially, and the subsequent impact that would be had after the fact, much later on down the line. For example, volcanoes don't just pour lava everywhere. They also greatly replenish the quality of farmland hundreds of years later. And you'll need both to understand the immediate and less immediate effects that these events cause. Anyway, that's enough for this week. So with that, I'm out. I'll see you next time.